The world died in a blinding flash, and people went underground, where metal protects them from invisible death, where darkness became their home. Lead tunnels lay beneath the earth like a web of salvation. There was no sky here, only cracked ceilings and the eternal hum of fans. The first years remembered the light. Old people told children about the sun, but their words sounded like a fairy tale that no one really believed anymore. Robot dosimetrists went upstairs every morning. Their steel bodies were not afraid of radiation. They went where a human would burn instantly. The machines returned with data: radiation levels, air temperature, wind direction. The numbers were entered into archives and forgotten until tomorrow. The underground city grew slowly, corridor by corridor. People dug new halls, reinforced the arches, and pulled wires for dim electric light. Children here were born pale, with eyes accustomed to the dim light. They did not know what the horizon was, and did not miss what they had never seen. Engineers created air and water purification systems. Every drop counted. Every breath was the result of complex mechanisms and filters. Farms were located in huge halls under ultraviolet lamps. Mushrooms, algae, genetically modified vegetables, all food grew in metal boxes. Time flowed differently down there. There were no sunrises or sunsets, only shift changes and sirens marking the hours of monotonous existence underground. People worked, ate, slept, and worked again. Life had become a ritual of survival, where every action was governed by a strict schedule and necessity. Old music played from the speakers in the evenings. The melodies of the past reminded them of a world that once existed, but now seemed like a fiction and a myth. The robots left and returned, left and returned. Their metallic footsteps echoed through the corridors, calming people with their predictability. Sometimes the machines broke down upstairs. Then they weren't expected back. New ones were simply launched. Losses were part of the system. No one mourned the iron and circuits. The archives stored maps of the surface, photographs of cities that no longer existed. Librarians guarded these documents like sacred relics of the past. Young people dreamed of seeing the sky, but these dreams were abstract, devoid of real power. The desire was born from books, not from the memory of the heart and body. Scientists continued their research. In laboratories, they studied radiation, looked for ways to accelerate the decay of isotopes, and hoped for a breakthrough that would return the Earth to people. But progress was slow. Each discovery required decades of work, and the results were often disappointing. Nature was in no hurry to forgive humanity for its mistakes. The lead walls were covered with drawings. Artists depicted trees, birds, clouds, everything they had only seen in faded photographs from the underground museum. Religion changed underground. People prayed not to the gods of the heavens, but to the spirits of the depths, asking for protection from landslides and blessings for the harvest in artificial gardens. Holidays were celebrated rarely, but brightly. On these days, they turned on all the lamps at once, prepared the best food, and danced in the main hall to music recorded in former times. Children played in the corridors, their laughter ringing under the arches. They chased balls, built forts out of boxes, and made up stories about heroes saving the world from monsters. Sometimes accidents happened. A tunnel collapsed, the ventilation system failed, a generator exploded. Then people would come together, repair, rebuild, and bury the dead. The cemetery was located in the farthest hall. It was quiet and dark here, with only small lights burning at each slab, bearing the name and dates of a short life. Memories of the surface faded with each generation. Few people remembered the real sun, and soon there would be no one left who had breathed the air of the open sky. The robots were becoming more perfect. The new models were faster, more accurate, and could work longer without maintenance. They explored further and further from the entrance to the underground. The surface maps were replenished with data. Dead cities, overgrown forests of mutated plants, rivers with poisonous water. The machines recorded all this and transmitted it down, but no one hoped to return to the surface. It would be suicide. Even in spacesuits, people would not last an hour in the open air of this poisoned world. Engineers dreamed of domes, of protected cities on the surface. They drew up plans, calculated the thickness of the walls, but there were not enough resources even to maintain the underground. Education was compulsory. Every child learned to read, count, and understand the life support systems. Knowledge meant survival for the entire community here, below. Teachers told stories about human history, about wars, discoveries, and the catastrophe that drove people underground. The lessons were harsh, without embellishment or illusions. Politicians argued about the distribution of resources. Every decision could save or destroy hundreds of people. Power here meant responsibility for life and death. Riots were rare, but effective. When injustice became unbearable, people would go out into the main corridor, demand change, and then the rulers would make concessions. Love blossomed even in the leaden tunnels. Men and women found each other, started families, had children, hoping that their descendants would have a better life. Weddings were held in a large hall decorated with garlands of paper flowers. Brides wore white dresses sewn from old sheets and smiled, forgetting the darkness around them. Old age came quickly underground. The lack of sunlight, hard labor, and poor nutrition all aged the body. Few lived to see gray hair and grandchildren, but every life lived mattered. Each person was a link in the chain of survival, and their death weakened the entire community, making it more vulnerable to a hostile world. Doctors fought disease in small infirmaries. There was a shortage of medicines, and much had to be done by hand, relying on experience and intuition rather than technology. Epidemics wiped out entire sectors. Quarantines were imposed, the clothes of the dead were burned, and prayers were said that the infection would not spread further along the narrow corridors. But life went on. After each tragedy, people recovered, rebuilt, and gave birth to new children who filled the void left by those who had gone forever. The robots worked tirelessly. They knew no fear, felt no pain, simply carried out their program. Go upstairs, measure, return, transmit data, recharge. Technicians serviced the machines with almost religious care. Every screw, every microchip was important. Without robots, people would go blind, lose contact with the surface. Data accumulated over the years, but did not change significantly. Radiation was declining slowly, so slowly that it seemed as if time on the surface had stopped at the moment of the disaster. Physicists believed that it would take another 300 years before the Earth would become habitable. 300 years was a period longer than the imagination of the people here could comprehend. But one day, one of the robots returned with an anomaly in its memory. The technicians noticed a strange file, an audio recording made on the surface, where nothing living should have been. The file was opened in the main hall. The speakers were turned up to full volume. Silence hung over the crowd as crackling static filled the air, followed by a voice. A human voice. The voice was hoarse and distorted, but it was undoubtedly human. It spoke in broken language, mixing up words, but the meaning was clear. Here, living, help. North, shelter. The recording lasted only 10 seconds. Then there was static and silence again. But those 10 seconds were enough to turn the entire underground world upside down. Some shouted that it was a mistake, that the robot had broken down and played an old recording from the archive. Others believed that someone had survived above ground and found a way to exist in hell. The council convened immediately. Elders, scientists, military personnel, all argued until they were hoarse. Could an expedition be sent? Was there enough protection? Was it worth risking lives for a faint hope? The decision was postponed day after day. Fear was stronger than curiosity. What if there really was someone up there? What if it was a trap? What if the radiation killed the rescuers instantly? But the recording was listened to again and again. The young demanded action. The old called for caution. The tension grew, threatening to split the community into two hostile camps here below. Finally, a compromise was reached. Instead of sending people, A group of robots with improved sensors and cameras would be sent. The machines would find the source of the signal and transmit the image. The robots were prepared for a week. They checked every system, programmed new search algorithms, and installed powerful transmitters for long-distance communication from the base. The day of the expedition's launch was declared a holiday. People gathered at the airlock, seeing off the machines like heroes. Children waved their hands. Adults were silent, clenching their fists with excitement. The robots disappeared into the darkness of the lift shaft. The elevator carried them to the surface, to the light that killed all living things, to the secret that could change the future of humanity. The connection was good. The broadcast was shown in the main hall, where a huge screen had been installed. People watched as the cameras showed the grey sky, ruins, and skeletons of buildings overgrown with strange plants. The robots moved north, following the coordinates from the recording. Kilometer after kilometer, they passed through the dead land, recording radiation levels that were high but no longer lethal. On the third day of the journey, the sensors detected an anomaly, a metal structure underground, protected by layers of concrete and lead. Another shelter that no one down below had known about before. The robots found the entrance, blocked by debris. They spent hours clearing the passage, moving stones and beams. Cameras broadcast every movement to the underground city where no one slept, glued to their screens. When the passage opened, warm air blew out of the darkness. The robots descended the steps into corridors, similar to those that had been home to thousands of people under the lead vaults. People lived here too. The lamps burned dimly. The ventilation system worked with difficulty. Pictures hung on the walls, childish, naive, depicting the sun and flowers. The robots went deeper. Sensors detected movement. The cameras turned and showed a figure, a man in rags, thin, bearded, with eyes full of fear and hope at the same time. The man spoke, but his voice trembled. He said that their shelter was smaller, that people were dying of disease, that the systems were collapsing. He asked for help, begged not to be left alone. A murmur of voices rose in the main hall of the underground city. Thousands of people saw that they were not alone in this world. Somewhere above, under other arches, there were others like them, struggling and suffering. The decision came quickly. They had to help. They had to equip an expedition, send medicine, engineers, food. The risk was great, but leaving people to die was inhuman and against the laws of survival here. They prepared for months. They created new generation protective suits, checked routes, and gathered supplies. Hundreds of volunteers signed up for the expedition, even though they knew that not all of them would return. The first group set off in the spring according to the underground calendar. 20 people in heavy spacesuits rose to the surface, stepped out under the grey sky, and headed north to where salvation awaited them. The journey took a week. Radiation gnawed at the protection of their suits, the counters clicked alarmingly, but the people kept going. They carried medicine, seeds, knowledge, and hope that humanity was not yet lost. The meeting of the two communities was silent and tearful. People hugged each other through their suits, unable to believe that they were seeing other living people. The loneliness that had lasted for decades crumbled away like dust at that moment. Engineers began repairing the systems. Doctors treated the sick. Teachers shared their knowledge. The two communities merged into one, realizing that together they had a better chance of surviving this endless winter of peace. A permanent connection was established. Now the two underground cities communicated every day, coordinating their work, sharing resources and news. The world became a little bigger, a little brighter. The robots found 3 more shelters. One was inhabited only by children and the elderly, another by the military, and the third by scientists who kept a digital library of knowledge. Gradually, a network of underground cities took shape. People traded, exchanged specialists, and formed marriages between communities. The isolation ended, and with it went some of the hopelessness that had weighed heavily for years. The population grew. There was hope that humanity would not die out. that it would find a way to exist until the surface became safe. Children were born more often, and that was a good sign. Scientists joined forces. Laboratories in different cities worked on joint projects: soil purification, breeding radiation-resistant plants, and creating technology for life on the surface. Progress accelerated. The exchange of knowledge yielded results that had previously seemed impossible. Discoveries followed one after another, bringing the day of humanity's return to the Earth under the sky closer. The first experimental farms were set up on the surface. Domes made of special plastic protected the plants from radiation. The harvest was modest, but the very fact seemed like a miracle. 10 years later, there was already a whole village under the domes on the surface. Volunteers lived here, brave people willing to take risks for the sake of the future. They grew food, breathed purified air, and looked at the sky. The children born in this village were the first in 100 years to see the real sun. They played in the gardens under the dome, unaware of the fear of light that had been their enemy for so long. The surface cities grew slowly but steadily. Each new dome was a victory over disaster, proof that humans were capable of reclaiming the world they had destroyed. The underground cities did not become empty. Many did not want to leave the tunnels that had become their home. Here were the graves of their ancestors. Here was their whole life. Not everyone wanted to go up to the strange light. Society split peacefully. Those who wanted to go to the surface went up. Those who preferred the depths stayed. Both groups respected each other's choices and always kept in touch. The robots continued their work. Now they not only measured radiation, but also built, cleaned the soil, and planted trees. Machines became partners with humans in the revival of the world. Forests began to grow in protected areas. Genetically modified trees quickly grew tall, their roots binding the contaminated soil, their leaves purifying the air. Nature returned, changed but alive. Birds appeared 20 years after the first domes. They were released from laboratories, species resistant to elevated radiation levels. They flew over the villages, and their singing was the best music for those who remembered the dead silence. The rivers were cleaned up over decades. Filters worked day and night, passing water through systems that removed isotopes and poisons. The fish did not return quickly, but their return was celebrated as the rebirth of the world. The old people from the underground rose to the surface before they died. They wanted to see the sky at least once, feel the wind on their faces, die under the sun, not under leaden domes. They were buried in gardens under domes. The graves were decorated with fresh flowers, a luxury unthinkable in the underground world. Death under the open sky seemed a fitting end to a long journey. Young people learned to live on the surface. This required new skills, working in the fields, repairing domes, operating air purification systems. Life above ground was more difficult, but freer. The cities under the domes became beautiful. Architects designed buildings with windows that let in light. Streets were decorated with trees and fountains. Aesthetics returned to human life. Art flourished. Artists painted pictures from life, sunrises, clouds, rain. Musicians composed symphonies inspired by the sound of the wind. Poets sang of the world's rebirth in verses that were passed from mouth to mouth. Libraries were replenished with new books. People wrote the history of those years, about the catastrophe, about survival, about the return. Future generations had to remember the price their ancestors had paid for the right to breathe freely. The first child born entirely on the surface without the protection of a dome appeared 50 years after the beginning of the revival. Radiation had fallen to safe levels over a large area around the main city. That day was declared the beginning of a new era. People came out of the domes, took off their masks, and breathed air that did not kill them. Tears streamed down the faces of the elderly who remembered the disaster. Cities were built faster. Heavy protective domes were no longer needed, although they were left as monuments to a time when every breath was a gift. Architecture became bolder, reaching upward. Roads connected settlements. Cars drove along them, carrying goods, people, and ideas. The world was reassembling itself like a puzzle, where each piece found its place under the endless sky. The oceans remained dead the longest. The water stubbornly retained radiation, refusing to purify itself. But scientists worked here too, creating microorganisms capable of absorbing isotopes and converting them into safe forms. 100 years later, the first fish from the ocean was declared safe to eat. Markets were filled with seafood, and it was a return to a taste lost generations ago. Underground cities gradually emptied. Young people left for the surface, and the elderly died. The tunnels were turned into museums, where school children were taken to see how their ancestors had lived during the years of darkness. The lead walls were covered with inscriptions, names, dates, prayers, curses. All this was preserved as a reminder of a time when humanity was on the brink of extinction, but did not give up or retreat. Dosimetry robots worked less and less. Their functions changed. Now they were archaeologists, exploring the ruins of the old world, finding artifacts of a civilization that had destroyed itself. The finds were taken to museums, fragments of the world before the catastrophe, toys, books, photographs, technology. People looked at this with sadness and understanding. Mistakes must not be forgotten, otherwise they will be repeated. Education included lessons on the history of the catastrophe. Children were told in detail, without embellishment, what had led to the explosion. Greed, pride, irresponsibility. These lessons were harsh, but always necessary. The new civilization was built on different principles. Ecology was paramount, and technologies were tested by dozens of laboratories before implementation. The fear of repeating mistakes was stronger than any law. Energy has changed completely. Solar panels and wind turbines covered roofs and fields. Nuclear power plants were taboo, the very word evoking horror and disgust in people that did not fade even after centuries. The world was becoming green. Forests covered areas that were once dead wastelands. Animals returned, released from reserves and laboratories. Life took its course, stubborn and indomitable. Birds built nests on the roofs of houses. Deer grazed in city parks. Wolves howled at night in forests that were spreading further and further. The balance was being restored slowly but inevitably, following the laws of nature. It was not only people who celebrated holidays. On the day of the spring equinox, all work stopped. People went out into the fields and forests to thank the earth for taking them back after all they had done. Religion was transformed. Nature cults appeared, where people prayed not to gods, but to the planet itself. Rituals included planting trees, cleaning rivers, and caring for animals. Faith became practical, aimed at preserving peace. Old temples lay in ruins on the outskirts of inhabited areas. They were not rebuilt, left as a reminder of a time when prayers did not save from disaster and actions could have, but were not taken. Trade between cities flourished. Each region specialized in something different. One grew grain, another made tools, and a third created art. Trade enriched everyone, making society resilient to crises. Science developed cautiously. Every project underwent environmental assessment. Scientists remembered that it was their predecessors who had created the weapons that destroyed the world. Responsibility weighed heavily on every researcher here. Medicine conquered most of the diseases that appeared after the catastrophe. Mutations were studied, and ways to prevent and treat them were found. Life expectancy increased, and people became healthier and stronger.
Turn out